Was your school integrated? If so, how integrated?
I went to Catholic school for 5th to 8th grade, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a public school for 3rd and 4th. The public school was integrated, but very few black people.
And your Catholic school then wasn't?
It was, if there were African American Catholics, there just weren't that many.
Yeah.
They were not in my class, but they were in the school, yes.
Okay. Were there more integrated schools where you lived, or schools that had a more even distribution, or?
No, it was pretty much uneven. There was schools where most of the black people lived, like in Wyandanch, which had mostly a black population in the public schools. And the other schools that had mostly white population. In other words, it was segregated by choice where people chose to live.
Mm-hmm.
At that point in time, many people who were white wouldn't want to move into, certainly not an all-black neighborhood, but they might not like and might even discourage black people from moving into their neighborhood.
Okay.
So it was prejudicial in that it was, I'm sure my parents picked a district that was already mostly white. All my neighbors were white.
Yeah. What did you do for entertainment as a kid and young adult?
Well, we played street football, baseball, stickball outside a lot, and watched TV at night. There were family shows, and I practiced piano.
What type of music or musicians were popular when you were growing up?
Ooh, I didn't really get into much of the doo-wop stuff, but that's what was popular. Later on in college, and the Beatles were very, very popular. Elvis Presley. But also like crossover pop singers like Bobby Darin, and always listen to Frank Sinatra. Always listen to I always like the jazz people and the jazz singers, but also classical music I listen to a lot because I played it.
Yeah. You wanted to be a famous jazz musician one day,
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
That was your dream. What was a typical day at school like?
In the Catholic school, it was subject after subject after subject. Break for lunch and subject after subject. English, history, math. Very little science in the Catholic schools. Social studies. But that was history. It was actually more straight history, English, math, religion. And there was another subject I can't think of. No art, no music, and very, very little science.
So you just had to do art outside of school?
I didn't do it at all. That's why I still
Piano.
can't draw. Yeah, and
That's
too. They
and
didn't have
art.
music. Yes, my music was outside.
Okay. When do you?
They did have art in the 2 years of public school in 3rd and 4th grade, and a music teacher, but that was short-lived because I
Yeah.
went into the Catholic school. Yes.
When do you first remember learning about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement?
Probably when he first came out in protest. There were a lot of violent protests prior to Martin Luther King. A lot of, gatherings of African American people, throwing things at each other. It was a mess. All I can remember is that most of the white people thought that they were behaving like animals. Most of the black people were treated like crap all their lives, and this was just another example of it.
Yeah.
But Martin Luther King seemed to change the face of it in terms of the violent protests. He still wasn't very accepted by members of my family, but they just thought he was like a rebel rouser because he was stirring up trouble. They wanted things to stay the same. Just go back, don't complain.
What did you think of him as a kid and then now?
As a kid, it was hard to say because I was so influenced by what my parents and uncles were saying and thinking. But by the time I got to college, I was pretty much behind him. And, marched in a couple of civil rights demonstrations and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. Not a lot, maybe one or two of each.
What were you doing when you found out Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated?
I don't remember.
You don't remember?
No.
We should do something about that.
I don't know who that is. 615.
Okay. Where was I? So you don't remember?
I don't remember what I was doing when Martin Luther King was shot. I remember what I was doing when Kennedy was shot.
Well, that's later. We'll wait.
That's weird.
Sorry, Miss Martin Klein. And they don't leave a message. Typical. Oh, no, they didn't.
Right now, I'm calling North Carolinians like yourself to participate in a special live, toll-free meeting to discuss our upcoming campaign and see what.
Okay. Anyway. Sorry. Did you watch or see any civil rights protests when you were growing up? In
Yes.
news or in person? And do you remember how people reacted to these protests?
Not really big ones. At college, there were some, but they weren't that large. In Eugene, it was, again, predominantly white college. Not that many black people were there. So it was small amounts. But, yeah, little protesting, sign carrying, not anything that ever got by.
Yeah, I mean, you also weren't in the South, so it wasn't a need to, I guess, fight, but still present.
Yeah. I mean, they said that the North was more integrated and more open, but it really wasn't. That's not true, but, you know.
How did your hometown change during the 60s? And if it changed at all?
Well, it's changed since, but I don't know in the 60s as there was a big change. You got to realize most of the radical movements in the 60s didn't really take effect and amount to anything till the 70s and the 80s. So during the 60s, everybody's house was the same. Everybody still played outside, stickball, and the neighborhood kids hung out. So I didn't really notice much of a difference. Still went to the movies, still listened to the music. So it wasn't that big a difference. How it transformed the country is much deeper over a longer period of time.
Yeah. Do you remember the assassination of JFK?
Yes, I do.
What do you remember?
I was coming out of school, and I was in 10th grade, and coming out of school, and some of the kids said, the president was shot. And I said, are you kidding? So it was like then, it was all over the news. I went home, my mother was crying. Everybody was devastated.
You including? You were devastated?
Yeah, I liked President Kennedy. So, you know, but I wasn't crying about it, but I mean, it was a tragedy. Everybody knew.
Mm-hmm. How did your immediate and or extended family feel about the civil rights movement and its leaders? You already touched on that.
Yeah, not much. They weren't enthusiastic about it. I think they still were. They were brought up from the place where you should overcome from within and just deal with your adversities. I suspect that the Italian people in my family thought that they suffered what the black people suffered because they suffered prejudice and refusal to get a job or get a better education, but they thought it was severe. It wasn't. It wasn't like the black people suffered for hundreds of years, and then, but they felt it. They all felt that, well, everybody was calling them giddy wop and calling them names and not giving them the choice jobs, and they weren't getting into the schools and getting the scholarships. So they felt that they were being prejudiced against, and they were, but only slightly. And they felt that they overcame it and thought that that's what the black people should do and not complain by
Suck it
hurting
up,
people.
kind of.
Suck it up and stop being violent. It's not accomplishing anything. Yes, that was their prevailing attitude.
Did you or anyone you know ever participate in any civil rights protests? If so, when and where did it take place? And
yeah, well, one in college, I said, and also an anti-Vietnam War protest. I marched in one in college. That was it.
Why did you choose to participate?
Because my friends were there.
So none of your own personal.
The civil rights thing was more. It might have even been organized by a church, not the Catholic Church, but a church up there, because it was pretty peaceful. the anti-war thing was big for me because I was going to have to go. It was a
Oh
big
wow.
deal.
Um.
So it affected me because I was going to get drafted.
Mhm. So no moral issue with civil rights, really. It was just kind of a bandwagon thing.
Yeah, it wasn't until I got to meet and talk with black people in my classes, history class especially, one kid in particular, that I realized that this is a much bigger thing than I'm aware of.
What did the kids say to you to make you change your
That
view?
this doesn't wash off the black skin and you're stuck with it for life. And I thought, well, my skin doesn't wash off too. But he made it seem much more profound, and so did the history teacher, and so did the kids in class. And I started to rethink that, that you wear that your whole life, and people judge you a lot by that skin color.
That's really hard to come away from a family opinion and do something.
Oh yeah, that was the biggest change happening in the '60s, is that kids were revolting against the upbringing of the parents.
Did
the sexual mores.
Were your parents very offended when you had these views, I guess, or just
No, they didn't
shocked?
really. No, because they knew the black people were treated shabbily, but they just didn't want anything done about it, or they weren't
They weren't adamant.
Yes.
When do you first remember learning about Malcolm X? What did people?
You know what? I never learned about Malcolm X.
Never?
Never.
Until later in your life?
Much, much later. And still, today, I don't know much of what he did.
Oh. Well.
Just be honest with you, today. A spot of ignorance. Probably the people at Central would be appalled. But I never read his books. I never knew much about him. He's a dark figure for me. And not as
no pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended.
You already mentioned this, but besides the civil rights protests, did you or anyone you know participate in any other protest movements?
The Vietnam War.
Yeah. Did you or anyone you know serve in Vietnam? I know you said that you were going to be drafted, but...
Right. Many of my friends, many died. Many came back wounded. Many had, a lot of my high school class. A lot of them never came back.
Is that the reason you still donate to programs like that?
I donate to the veterans. Yeah. Yeah, I've always done that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. What are your remembrances of that war in those times?
That it was all, and I'm not sure I had a correct picture because I had now just the opposite view from the kids in college who were all against it, who all thought it was a civil war we should have butted out of. It was a war we put ourselves in. We lost it, and we basically did lose it in the arena of like propaganda. The media was dead set against it, and they really hyped it to where everything that went on was catastrophic and wrong and immoral, and the way they photographed it and presented it, and may have been an immoral war. I certainly was convinced it was immoral, but I'm not so sure that was because I didn't want to go. I toyed with being a conscientious objector. I toyed with leaving the country. My friend did. My good friend Jimmy DeWark left and went to England.
Yeah.
So many people did leave. Many people were conscientious objectors. I did speak to a lawyer about it, and he said, well, if you're going to do that, you got to be prepared to go to jail. And to be honest with you, I wasn't that much against it because I found an out, which was joining a band, which kept me in New York and Long Island. I hated myself for doing it. I thought I sold out. But still, I did it, and it kept me home and kept me, taking lessons with Lenny Tristano and playing gigs and stuff in New York City, so I didn't have to leave the city area.
Yeah. Do you have any opinions of Presidents Johnson or Nixon?
Yes, both.
Okay, we'll start with Johnson.
President Johnson was a man who was completely over. He campaigned on peace. Mm-hmm. Barry Goldwater was going to go in the Vietnam War and win it. Mm-hmm. That's what my parents wanted. That's what I thought made sense. You don't fight a war halfway. But then he went and fought it halfway, and he appropriated troops on his own signature without congressional approval, which they've since curtailed the president's ability to do it in that kind of numbers. and just hundreds of thousands on his. So the war got pasted to him, and he got to be the warmongering president. And all the radicals and people who spoke at colleges were very, very much down on him. LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Those were quotes. Those are things. Chanting, yes, signs like that.
And then Nixon.
Nixon was, my parents were Republicans, so I thought it was good in the beginning, but of course he got, again, Watergate crippled him, and he lied about it. He did pretty much what Clinton did with Monica Lewinsky, except he just kept at it and kept using the FBI, kept using his power in office to hide more and more of what he said. What he really did, in all honesty, is no different than just about what every president does. They try to get the secrets of the other party, their strategy for election, so that they can beat them at it. Many presidents have done this before and since, but he lied and he lied and he covered it up, and it got worse and worse, and it
just escalated, yeah.
And he was going to be impeached, and his own party told him he better resign. And he did.
Going back a bit, did the area you live in, so New York as a whole, and I guess Long Island especially, pay much attention to the civil rights movement, its leaders, or its protests, or were they just, as your family was, which is kind of separated?
No, I think they paid a lot of attention to it, but it just didn't affect me immediately, or the neighborhood per se. There weren't like protests in the neighborhood.
So kind of
But everybody knew about it. Everybody was talking about it every day. That would be the things we'd argue about at Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Did you feel comfortable enough to, I mean, you said you talked about it with your family, but did you talk about it with, like, strangers? Was it something, like, everyone was talking about, or was it just kind of, like, one of those behind closed doors opinions, like we talk about politics and religion now?
It was more, I guess, closed. I mean, I talk about it with strangers. But school, yeah, and friends and new teachers and the relatives and people like that. Yeah, I think it was more that way. More that we were just people you knew. It was always a topic of conversation. It wouldn't be something I would have brought up with too many strangers.
Okay. What do you think is the most significant change during your lifetime, your whole entire lifetime? That could be recent or now, or back then.
Roe versus Wade, for me.
What is?
That was the judicial decision that allowed abortion. Actually, what it really said is the states could not make a law restricting someone's access to abortion. And it even defined it more narrowly to the first 3 months.
Okay.
You could make laws to restrict it after the first 3 months in Roe. But then the follow-up decision of Doe versus Bolton said you can do it anytime, any reason, virtually. If you read it, it's for any kind of excuse for health. Health reasons meant anything.
Do you think that was the biggest?
Well, now, those two decisions were the biggest change I think in the country in my life. That and 9/11 is the next biggest event that would have the biggest impact on this country.
Yeah, that one
is
definitely
ongoing. Yeah,
has had a big impact.
Okay. I remember what I was doing at 9/11.
So you taught elementary school at a certain point in your life?
Yes, for 2 years.
And then later, what years were those?
1970.
Something.
1 and 2, or 2 and 3.
And then you taught high school and later, and now college, right?
Yeah, I never really taught high school.
Oh, okay. So it's just elementary school and then jumped straight to college?
Well, elementary school, and I quit teaching, and then went and played professionally, and then got a master's degree, and realized that if I wanted to teach, I'd want to teach on a higher level. So that's why I got a master's degree.
Okay. Well, we recently looked at different things, and we're talking about how more currently high schools and colleges and things like that are starting to shift towards resegregating themselves just naturally. Have you noticed this, or?
Yeah, I do. And I think further what's going to happen is in the next 50 years, matriculating to college is going to be meaningless. You're just going to do everything right here from your laptop at home. There's not a single course that the teacher can't post the lectures,
Mm-hmm.
give you tests, read your reports and your papers. You can submit everything online. In fact, it almost has to be. So do we need the classroom and the classroom space? Other than for a choir, a band, a dance troupe, an acting group where you have to work with people in tandem, I don't know if you need much classroom time for almost any other course.
Okay.
So I think it's moving in that direction and consequently segregating itself naturally. Also, the finances of college are what segregate people, because if you don't have a lot of money or you don't get a scholarship, you're going to have to go with what you can afford.
Yeah. You work at Central,
Yes.
Duke, and UNC.
Yes.
Part-time at Duke and UNC, full-time at Central.
Right.
Just to clarify. Going way back to one of our first questions, but I think probably the things you feel most driven towards is jazz music. That's what you do. It's what you love. I mean, you got your degree in classical, but...
Yes. 2 degrees in classical music.
And did you see a difference because of the amount of historically, I guess, I mean, there were lots of black singers, Ella, stuff like that, because it was so populated with that. Did you find that in the jazz community with your friends there that they were a little bit more open to civil rights, or they liked the idea of segregation, or they weren't as cruel?
No, they were much more open. In fact, when I went to school, the first guy, a friend, piano player, much better jazz player than I was, he said, well, who do you listen to? And I was listening to, some of the old black players that my father listened to, like Teddy Wilson, and Earl Father Hines and Lionel Hampton. Those are the swing players. But I wasn't listening to any of the modern players. I would be listening to Andre Previn and George Shearing and white players who had a slight impact but weren't very influential. And then that was the first thing was my friend told me, oh, you got to start listening to Bud Powell and blah, blah, blah. And gave me like 5 or 6 piano players, Herbie Hancock, McCoy Tyner, to go buy records of, and I did, and my life was never the same. That was it. So realizing that the music comes from the African-American rhythms and their culture, they became my idols and my heroes. And even when I studied with Lenny Tristano, who was a white musician, but all that he recommended you sing and internalize were Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Bud Powell, all the great black African-American players who innovated all of the styles of jazz.
So then, likewise.
So then a respect and a reverence for what they did and gave also made everybody that I talked to, then we were on their side more than anybody else's. Right.
So your passion of music kind of led you to become more accepting.
Right.
I think that's pretty much it. But I think that's a beautiful outlook,
Yep.
especially for an art school.